They laughed at Emmett Cole the day he signed for that ranch. 60 acres of dead grass, a barn that leaned like a drunk against the wind, and a house where the roof had given up years before the man who built it did. The lawyer slid the papers across the table like he was doing the boy a cruelty, not a kindness. Every rancher in Caddo County knew what old Hollies had left behind. Nothing. Dust with a fence around it. But I've kept the rain ledger in this valley for 41 years. I write down every drop that falls and every day it doesn't. And there's one thing I learned from all that counting. The land tells the truth long before the people do. What that broken-down ranch was hiding didn't make sense. Not to the bank, not to the water men and their clean trucks, not even to me, and I'd lived next to it my whole life. It was worth more than every working spread in 3 counties combined. And Emmett almost died before he ever found it. I heard the digging before I understood it was digging. 3 in the morning and I'm awake the way old women are awake, which is to say not sleeping and not resting, just lying there listening to the house tick. My name's Ada Rennick. I've got 73 years on me and a bad hip that predicts weather better than the radio, and that night my hip was quiet, which meant the drought would hold, which meant tomorrow would be exactly as dead as today. Then chunk, 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 metal into hardpan, slow, wrong hour. I keep a ledger by my bed. Not just rain, I write down anything the valley does that it shouldn't. A habit my husband called nosiness and I called paying attention, and he's been gone 11 years so I've stopped arguing the point. I wrote, 3 a.m. digging, Cole Place. Then I pulled a coat over my nightdress, because a woman who writes down other people's business ought to at least have the decency to go confirm it. The Cole Place shared a fence line with mine. Old Hollies and I had feuded across that wire for 30 years over a cattle guard neither of us needed, which is the kind of thing you do in a place where nothing else happens. When he died that spring, I'll admit I stood at my kitchen window and cried, and I'll admit I didn't know why, and I'll admit I never told a soul until now. His nephew had shown up 2 weeks later, a stranger to all of us. Lean, quiet, maybe 30, with a face that looked like it had been left out in the rain and never quite dried. Emmett Cole. He'd inherited the ruin, and from what the whole town could tell, he had nowhere else to go, because a man with somewhere else to go does not stay. I walked the fence line in the dark with a flashlight I didn't turn on, because the moon was doing fine and I didn't want him to see me coming. The digging got louder. And then I came around the collapsed corner of his corral, and I saw where the sound was coming from, and my stomach dropped through the ground. The old well. Hollies' dry well. A stone throat in the earth, capped with rotten boards for as long as I'd been alive, because it had gone dry the year I was married and nobody ever bothered with it again. The boards were thrown off, and down in that black mouth, 30 feet down, a light was moving. Boy, I said, then louder because my voice cracked. Boy. The digging stopped. That well's not shored, I called down. You know that, you know it can come down on your head. A long silence. Then his voice floated up, flat and tired, echoing off the wet stone. It's not going to come down. You an engineer now? No, ma'am. A pause. But it's held 100 years. I figure it can hold one more night. I've replayed that answer 100 times since. I figure it can hold one more night. That was the whole of Emmett Cole, right there, if I'd been smart enough to hear it. A man measuring the world one held together night at a time, because he didn't dare count any further ahead than that. I made him come up. Took some doing. He climbed the old iron rungs slow, and when his head came into the moonlight I saw his hands were bleeding. Not blistered, bleeding. The skin gone off his palms in strips, and he'd been swinging that pick anyway into rock at 3 in the morning with hands that looked like that. Lord, I said, what are you doing to yourself? He looked at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. There's water down there, he said. There's no water down there. There hasn't been water in that well since Eisenhower. There's water down there, he said again, softer, and he wasn't arguing with me. He was arguing with the whole valley, with the drought, with the lawyer, with everyone who'd laughed. He just happened to be doing it in front of me. I want you to understand what the drought was, so the rest of this makes sense. 3 years by then. 3 years of a sky that promised and lied. The Coldwater River that gave our county its name had gone to a green trickle you could step across without wetting your boots. Ranchers were selling stock at a loss because they couldn't water them, and the ones who couldn't sell were watching cattle die at dry tanks, and a dead cow at a dry tank makes a sound I won't describe to you. The town of Dry Fork, we'd always thought the name was a joke. It stopped being funny around year 2. Wells were failing all up and down the valley. The aquifer had dropped past where our pumps could reach. Men who'd never prayed a day were driving to the county line to buy hauled water at prices that made you sick. That was the country Emmett Cole inherited. Not just a broken ranch. A broken ranch in a dying place, where even the men with money and good land were going under. So when he said there's water down there, in that dead well, on that dead land, it wasn't hope. It sounded more like a man who'd lost his mind in a quiet, methodical way. I took him to my kitchen and cleaned his hands because he clearly wasn't going to. He sat at my table like a scolded boy while I picked grit out of his palms with tweezers, and he flinched but he didn't make a sound, and I found that harder to watch than if he'd hollered. "Why do you think there's water?" I asked him, just to keep him talking, just to keep myself from thinking about his hands. He was quiet a while, then he said, "Because my uncle wrote it down." I stopped with the tweezers. Emmett had a letter. He carried it in his shirt pocket, folded soft as cloth from being handled, and he showed it to me that night, and I'm going to tell you what it said because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. It was in Holly's hand. I knew that spiky, angry handwriting. I'd read enough of his ugly notes across the fence to know it anywhere. It was dated 8 months before he died, and it wasn't sentimental because Holly's wasn't, but there was one line in it that I read 3 times. "The well is dry because I made it dry. When they've all gone or died and the watermen have quit sniffing around, uncap it. It's yours. It was always going to be yours. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you why." "Made it dry," I said. "What in God's name does that mean, made it dry?" "I don't know." Emmett looked at me with those rained-on eyes. "But he wasn't a liar, was he? You knew him. Was he a liar?" And there it was, the cruel little hook of it. Because no. Holly's Cole was a mean, stubborn, fence-feuding old rattlesnake of a man, and I disliked him for 3 decades. But a liar he was not. In 30 years of having him, I had never once caught him in a lie. If Holly's wrote that the well was dry because he'd made it dry, then somewhere in this valley of thirst was a man who'd had water and hidden it, and taken the reason to his grave, and left it to a nephew he'd never met. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I lay in bed with my ledger, and I did not know what to write. The next weeks I watched him, the way you watch a slow accident. Emmett worked that ranch like it owed him a debt and he intended to collect and sweat. He couldn't fix everything, so he fixed one thing a day, and I mean one thing: a section of fence, a corral gate, a window. He had no money. The ranch had eaten Holly's and left nothing. He ate from the garden he'd cleared out of the weeds, and he ate poorly and he got leaner. But every day one thing got fixed. He was building the place back the way a man says a rosary, not because he believed it would save him. Because the doing was the only thing between him and the dark. That's the trait if you're looking for one. Not courage, courage is loud. This was the quiet cousin of it, endurance, the refusal to lie down made into a daily chore. I brought him food because I'm nosy and because a bag of my tomatoes gave me an excuse to walk the fence and see what he'd done. We didn't talk much. He wasn't a talker, and I've done enough talking for 2 lifetimes. But I learned things in the gaps. I learned his wife had died. He said it once flat. "The way you'd report the weather, my wife passed 2 years back," and then he changed the subject so hard I heard it click. I never got a name or a how, but I understood after that why a man would take a dead ranch in a dying town. It wasn't that he had nowhere to go. It was that everywhere he might have gone, she wasn't. So he came to a place he'd never been, where the grief could be new, where nothing said her name. I learned he kept a log, same as me, little water-stained notebook. He wrote down his one-a-day fixes, and he wrote down the depth he'd dug in the well, and this got me, he wrote down the birds. Which ones came, which ones left. I asked him about it once, and he colored up like I'd caught him at something. Birds know where the water is, he said. Before we do, my granddad taught me, you watch the birds, you find the water. And what are your birds telling you, Emmett Cole? He looked out at the dead pasture, and something crossed his face, hope and the shame of having it. They're circling the north corner, he said. By the well. They come at dusk and they circle, and there's nothing there for them. No water, no seed, nothing. But they come. Now, I'm a practical woman. I've buried a husband and 100 head of cattle, and any romance I had about this land dried up with the river. But I have watched birds in this valley for 73 years, and I know that they do not circle nothing. The water men came in June. That's what we called them. Meridian Resource Partners, said the doors of their clean white trucks, but out here they were just the water men, and they'd been circling the county for a year, the way Emmett's birds circled the well. They bought up water rights from ranchers who were going under. Bought them cheap, because a drowning man doesn't dicker. Then they drilled deep, deeper than any of us could afford to, and they pumped, and they trucked it away out of the valley to cities and frackers and God knows where. And every gallon they took out was a gallon the rest of us would never see come back. We hated them and we sold to them, both at once, because that's what desperation does. It makes you hate the hand and take it anyway. Their man was named Prentice. Soft-spoken, good boots, the kind of handshake that's practiced its warmth in a mirror. He came to Emmett's fallen-down ranch because Meridian had done its homework, and Meridian's homework had turned up something the rest of us hadn't known to look for. I was there when he came, because I'd made it my business to be there most days, and Emmett had stopped pretending he minded. Prentice looked at the ruin of the place with an expression I couldn't read at first, and then I placed it, and it chilled me. He wasn't seeing a ruin. He was seeing a prize wearing a ruin as a disguise. Mr. Cole, he said, I'll be direct because I respect a working man's time. Meridian would like to purchase this property, all of it, free and clear. Emmett wiped his hands on his jeans. It's not for sale. You haven't heard the number. Don't need to. Prentice smiled like Emmett had said something charming. The number, he said, is $400,000. I have never in my life heard silence get that loud. $400,000 for 60 acres of dust and a dead well and a house you could see daylight through. For a place the lawyer had all but apologized for handing over. I looked at Emmett, and I watched something happen in his face that I've thought about ever since. I watched a man who had nothing, who ate from a weed-choked garden and dug at night with bleeding hands, be offered enough money to walk away from grief itself, to start over anywhere on earth, to never watch another dawn come up over a place his dead wife had never seen. And I watched him not say yes. Why, Emmett said, his voice had gone careful. Why's it worth that to you, this place? Tell me why. Prentice's smile flickered just once, just for a hair of a second, and in that flicker I saw that he hadn't expected the question, and that the question had a dangerous answer. Development potential, he said smoothly. There's no development out here, town's dying. Our analysis differs. You do analysis on a dead well, Emmett said. Not a question. He'd gone very still, the way a man goes still when the ground shifts under him and he's trying to find his balance before he lets on he's felt it. You drove out here, to the worst ranch in the county, and you offered me $400,000, and you're standing there telling me it's for development potential. He took a step toward Prentice, just one. My uncle capped that well, Emmett said quietly. He wrote me a letter about it before he died, said he made it dry on purpose. I've been trying to figure out why a man would do that for 3 months now. Another step. You want to help me figure it out? I have never been prouder of a person I barely knew. Prentice's face closed like a door. The warmth went out of the handshake he wasn't offering. "The offer's on the table for 30 days, Mr. Cole," he said. "I'd think hard. Places like this, they don't stay standing. And a man alone out here with no water and no money," he let it hang, and the threat in it was so soft you could almost mistake it for concern. "Well, 30 days." He touched his hat to me, which I did not acknowledge, and he got in his clean white truck and he drove away, and the dust of him hung in the dead air a long time. Emmett watched the dust settle. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since I'd met him, there was something bright and terrible in his face. "Ada," he said, "there's water down there, and they know it." We uncapped the well together 3 nights later. Not the top had been uncapped since the night I found him in it. It was the bottom, because Emmett had dug down through 30 feet of hardpan and gravel, and finally, at the very floor of that old shaft, he'd hit something that wasn't stone. He'd hit iron. A hatch, a round iron hatch, set into the bedrock at the bottom of the well, sealed with tar gone hard as coal and bolts that had rusted into a single mass. Somebody had built that. Somebody had come down into a dry well and sealed the earth itself shut, and then let the world believe the water was simply gone. It took us both. Me up top working the rope, him down below working the bolts with penetrating oil and a breaker bar and language I won't repeat, for 3 nights, because he'd only do it after dark now. He was afraid of the watermen's eyes, and he was right to be. The third night near dawn, I heard him make a sound I'd never heard him make. It wasn't pain. I'd learned his pain sounds by then, the flat little grunts. This was something else. This was a sound that came up out of a man from a deeper place, and I hauled myself over the well mouth with my bad hip screaming, and I shone the light down. Emmett was standing at the bottom of the shaft. The iron hatch was open beside him, thrown back on its hinge, and he was standing in water that hadn't been there an hour before. It was past his boots and climbing his shins, cold and black and moving, welling up out of the open earth like the ground had finally decided to weep. And it was rising. I could see it rising, and his face turned up to me in the flashlight, and it was wet. And I couldn't have told you then, and I can't tell you now how much of that was the water. "Ada," he said, and his voice broke clean in half. "Ada." The water kept rising. It was up to his knees. I started to yell at him to climb, to get out, that it would fill the shaft and take him. And then I understood, from the way he was standing there letting it come, that Emmett Cole had spent 2 years praying for something to finally overwhelm him. And here at last was something that could, and it wasn't grief. It was an artesian spring, pressurized, alive, sealed under the driest 60 acres in the driest county in the state. And I hadn't yet done the arithmetic that Prentice had done in a boardroom 100 miles away. I hadn't yet understood what a live spring is worth in a valley of dead wells, or what men will do to own it, or the choice that was already rolling toward that broken-down ranch like weather you can't outrun. I just knelt at the mouth of the well in my nightdress, at dawn, and watched a widowed stranger stand knee-deep in the impossible and weep. The water rose 11 feet in the shaft, and then it stopped, because it had found its level, and its level was 11 feet of standing water in a well the whole county swore was dead. We told no one. That was the first decision, and we made it fast and without discussing it much, the way you decide to duck when something's thrown at your head. Because Emmett had done the arithmetic now, we both had, and the arithmetic was terrifying. A live artesian spring in that drought, in that valley, feeding into that aquifer, was not worth $400,000. Prentice's offer hadn't been generous. It had been a steal, a lowball thrown at a broke stranger who Meridian assumed didn't know what he was sitting on. A spring like that, sold to the watermen, was worth millions. They'd drill it, cap the natural flow, pump it out under pressure, and truck the whole living heart of the valley away to cities that would never know the name of the place they'd drained. And there was a second thing, a worse thing. It came to me slow over the next few days, and when it landed, it took the wind out of me. The spring didn't just belong to Emmett. Not really. Water underground doesn't respect a fence. That spring fed the aquifer, our aquifer, the one under my land and the Dawsons and the Kelmscotts and every failing ranch in the valley. If it flowed free, unpumped, it might over years, over seasons, begin to bring the water table back up. Slow, not a miracle, but a start. The birds had been circling it for a reason. The land had been trying to tell us for a reason. Which meant Emmett Cole was standing on the one thing that might save all of us, and he could sell it for enough money to save only himself. I want to be fair to him, because the version where he's a saint is a lie, and Emmett would hate a lie told about him. He wanted the money, I saw it. I'd be a fool to pretend I didn't. He sat at my kitchen table the night after the water came up, and he put his fixed-up hands flat on the wood and he said, 400,000, Ada, and that's their first number. I could get them up. I could get real money. He wasn't gloating. He was scared. I could go somewhere, anywhere. I could, and he stopped. And I knew he'd been about to say I could stop hurting, and couldn't, because saying it out loud makes it a thing you're choosing instead of a thing that's happening to you. You could, I agreed, because it was true and he deserved the truth. You'd be all right, he said, and this is the part that undid me. He was trying to talk himself into leaving by making sure I'd survive it, this old woman he'd known 3 months. You've got your ledger. You've got you'd manage. You always have. Don't, I said, put that on me. Don't you dare make this a mercy you're doing me. If you sell to those men, you sell for you, and that's allowed, and I won't hate you for it, but you'll own it. You'll own the reason. He didn't sleep at my table that night, but he didn't leave it for a long while either. Prentice came back before the 30 days were up. He came back because Meridian had figured out we'd opened the well. I still don't know how they knew. Maybe they'd had a man watching. Maybe the flow showed up on some instrument of theirs, some gauge in a distant office that ticked up when the spring came alive. But he came back, and this time the soft was gone from him, and he brought a lawyer and a folder of papers and a survey map with our whole valley on it, and red lines drawn across it that I didn't understand until he explained them, and then wished I hadn't. Mr. Cole, no warmth now, just the machine underneath showing itself. I'll save us both the theater. You have an artesian source on this property. We've known since before I first came out. My initial offer was a courtesy. He set a paper on Emmett's fence rail. This is the new offer. I think you'll find it changes your outlook. Emmett looked at the number. I watched him look at it. I didn't see the number myself, not then, but I saw his face. And his face told me it was the kind of money that ends a sentence you've been trying to finish your whole life. And if I don't sell, Emmett said. His voice was very even. Prentice smiled without any smile in it. Then we drilled the adjacent parcel. The Kelmscott place we closed on a Tuesday. Our engineers tell me a deep well there will draw from the same formation. We'll pump it out from the side. He let that sit. You'll have a live spring on paper and a dry hole, in fact, and you'll have turned down more money than you'll see again in your life to keep water you can't stop us from taking anyway. Or, he tapped the paper, you take the number. And you let us do cleanly what we'll otherwise do the hard way. It was the cruelest thing I ever heard a man say and mean, and its cruelty was that it was probably true. They didn't need Emmett to say yes. They had the machines and the money and the Kelmscott place. God help the Kelmscotts, and they could drain the valley from the side and leave Emmett standing over a fortune that had gone to dust in his hands. His yes only made it faster and cheaper. His no cost him everything and saved no one. That's the morally heavy decision if you're keeping a list, except it wasn't the one you'd expect. The gun to Emmett's head wasn't money versus the town. Meridian had made sure of that. They'd arranged the world so that the town was lost either way. What was left to him was smaller and lonelier and harder, whether to take the money for water he couldn't save or refuse it, keep his own hands clean, and go under with everyone else for nothing. Take the fortune and be the man who sold the valley, or refuse it and be a poor man in a dead place who could at least say he never signed. Meridian had built him a trap with no righteous door. Emmett was quiet for a long time. The wind moved the dead grass. Somewhere his birds were circling a well that Meridian was already planning to reach around and empty. "Give me the 30 days," Emmett said finally. "The original 30. I've got a week of it left. I'll give you my answer then." Prentice studied him. Then he gathered his papers, unbothered, a man who'd already won. "7 days," he said. "The offer only goes down from here, Mr. Cole. Water like this, it's a depreciating asset the longer it sits." And he left, and this time his dust didn't hang. A wind had come up. First wind in weeks. Here is what Emmett Cole did with his 7 days. And it is the reason I am telling you any of this at all. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call Meridian's bluff or run the numbers or try to out-lawyer men who did nothing but lawyer. He came to my kitchen the first morning and he said, "Ada, whose land does that spring run under? All of them. I want the names. Everybody whose water table touches it." So we made a list. My ledger was good for that, 41 years of who owned what and where the water ran. 19 families. The Dawsons and the Kelmscotts and the Ortegas and the rest, all the failing spread strung along the dead river like beads on a broken necklace. And Emmett went to see every one of them. He drove Hollis's rusted truck up 19 driveways in 7 days, and he told each family the truth, all of it. The spring, the letter, Meridian's offer, the Kelmscott parcel, the side drilling, the whole trap. He told them there was a fortune under his ranch, and he told them the watermen meant to take it out from under all of them. And he told them the number Meridian had offered him, the life-changing, grief-ending number. And he told them he hadn't signed. I went with him to some of the visits. I watched grown ranchers, hard men, proud men, men who'd have died before they took charity, sit at their kitchen tables and listen to a stranger explain that the salvation of the whole valley was sitting under his worthless ranch, and that he could sell it and be rich, and hadn't. "Why are you telling us this?" old Cy Dawson said, suspicious. "Sure there was a catch. What do you want?" Emmett turned his cup around in his ruined hands. "There's a thing they can't do if we're together," he said. "They bought the Kelmscott place because Ray Kelmscott was going under alone and scared and cheap. That's how they take a valley, one scared man at a time." He looked up. "They can drill around one ranch. They can't drill around 19. Not if 19 ranches file on that water together. Not if we make it one thing instead of 19 things." He set the cup down. I looked it up. "There's a way to do it. A water district. A trust. I don't understand all of it. But a lawyer would if 19 families split his fee instead of one broke widower paying it alone." "You'd put your spring into a trust," Cy said slowly. "With the rest of us, your spring, worth what they offered you, you'd hand that over to a bunch of neighbors you met last Tuesday." "Not hand it over," Emmett said. "Share it. There's a difference and it matters to me." Then quieter, the truest thing I ever heard him say, "I already lost the one thing I'd have kept everything for. I don't have much use for a fortune, Cy, but I've got a real use for neighbors." The room was very quiet, and Cy Dawson, who was 79 and had buried a wife and 200 cattle and every soft thing he ever had, put his weathered hand over his eyes and left it there, and none of us said anything. And let him. They signed. Not all 19, 16. 3 held out, scared or bitter or in too deep to Meridian already, and I won't pretend it was a clean sweep, because it wasn't, because life isn't. But 16 families put their water into one trust, and a lawyer in the county seat, who took the case for a cut, and I suspect for the pleasure of it, filed the papers that made that living spring the shared property of a valley instead of the private property of a broke man Meridian could squeeze. You can't cheaply drill around 16 families with standing and lawyers and a filed claim. You can, but it costs, and it costs in courts, and it costs in years, and Meridian's whole model was the cheap, fast squeeze of the lonely and the scared. Emmett hadn't beaten them. Nobody beats the watermen, not really, not for good. But he'd made the valley expensive. He'd made it a fight instead of a purchase. And men like Prentice, faced with a fight, tend to drive their clean white trucks to some other dying place where the squeeze is still cheap. Prentice came for his answer on the seventh day. Emmett handed him the trust papers instead of a signature. I was there. I wouldn't have missed it. Prentice read them. His face did the door-closing thing. And then, I'll give him this, it was the only human moment I ever saw in him. He looked up at Emmett with something almost like respect, or maybe just the professional's regard for a losing move played well. You understand, Prentice said, you had $400,000, more. You could have walked away from all of this, from all of them. He gestured at the dead valley, the failing ranches, the whole hard poor place. You threw it in a pot with 16 broke families and a widow and a dead river, for nothing you couldn't have kept for yourself. I know what I did, Emmett said. Prentice shook his head slowly, put the papers on the fence rail and turned for his truck. And Emmett, I swear this is true, I wrote it in my ledger that night, Emmett called after him, not unkind, almost gentle. It was never going to be mine anyway. My uncle knew it. That's why he made it dry. He was keeping it. For when the valley needed it more than a rich man did. A pause. I just finally figured out what the letter meant. Prentice didn't answer. The white truck pulled out, and the first-in-week's wind took its dust, and it was gone. I'm an old woman, and I don't trust happy endings, so I won't hand you one. The drought didn't break that summer or the next. The spring flowed, and the trust managed it, and the aquifer came up slow, so slow, a few inches a season, not a miracle, never a miracle, just the ground being allowed to keep what was its own. Some ranches held on. The Ortegas didn't. They sold and moved to Amarillo, and I still get a Christmas card. The three who wouldn't sign got what the scared always get. Ray Kelmscott's place stayed Meridian's, a dry sidewell drilled into a formation they'd been outmaneuvered from draining, and I'm told they eventually sold it at a loss, which is the closest thing to justice this valley ever offers. Emmett stayed. Of course he stayed. He fixed his one thing a day until the ranch stopped being a ruin and started being a home, though he'd never call it that, and he ran a few head, and he watered them from a well that the whole county had sworn was dead, and he never got rich, and he never once, in all the years I knew him after, mentioned the number Meridian had offered him. I think he'd genuinely forgotten it. I think a man like Emmett has to forget a number like that, or it eats him. He never talked about his wife, either. But the spring in the north corner, the one that saved us, he named it. Just to himself, just on a little painted board he nailed by the well head where nobody much would see it. I saw it once, walking the fence, being nosy, being 70-something and unable to stop paying attention. It was a woman's name. I won't tell you what it was. It wasn't mine to know, and it isn't mine to give. I asked him once near the end of my knowing him whether he ever regretted it, the money, what he could have had. He was quiet the way he always got quiet. He watched his birds come in at dusk and circle the water that was really there now, the water that had always been there, waiting under the driest ground in the county for somebody poor enough and broken enough and stubborn enough to dig for it in the dark. I inherited a broken-down ranch, he said finally, that everybody swore was worth nothing. He almost smiled. Turned out it was hiding a fortune no one expected. I waited for him to say the rest. The part about how the fortune wasn't the water, was the neighbors, was the trust, was Cy Dawson's hand over his eyes at the kitchen table, was being needed by a valley when he'd stopped needing anything for himself. He didn't say it. He just watched the birds come down to the water and let me infer it, and I did. That was Emmett Cole. He trusted you to figure out the important things on your own.